I can welcome to the stage, to the screen, as it were, our next speaker. And we're joined this morning by Dr. Frances Chen, Associate Professor, Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia. She's an expert in social, mental, physical health, and she's going to talk. The first part of the presentation is going to focus really on something which we touched on in sort of general terms, I think, previously in the sessions. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into the actual physical impact that loneliness and social isolation have on people. So please do enter your questions in the chat as we go along. And Frances, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I love the poem. It's hard to follow, but I'll do my best. Loved your poem, loved everything that was in it and the sentiment it expresses. So yeah, great way to kick off the morning. I want to also thank Pete so much and Kiffer for bringing us together, as Pete was saying, as a community of like-minded people interested in this same issue and really motivated to come together to exchange ideas and hopefully also find solutions for this issue. So what I'm going to be talking about today, as John mentioned, is the biological impacts of social connection and loneliness and social isolation. But I will broaden it out a little bit to touch on some of the other themes that Pete also was mentioning about smartphone use and our daily habits and how those affect our social connection. So I've put here as a sort of working title, Social Connection as Health Behavior. And so to start that off, I first want to say, so the case I'm going to be trying to make here in my talk is that it's really essential that we be thinking about social connection as a health behavior. So what do I mean, first of all, by health behavior? Well, very simply put, a health behavior would be something that we personally can control in our individual lives that influences our health. And here's some examples of health behaviors that we've all heard about that our doctors tell us to do, our governments and policymakers tell us are super important, essential for reducing chronic illness risk, reducing mortality risk, and making sure we are healthy. So these would include getting regular physical activity, maintaining a normal body weight and eating well, and obtaining sufficient daily sleep. So the case I'm making here is that social connection really belongs on this list. It's as important as these other health behaviors that all of us know about already. And in terms of what I mean by social connection and thinking about social connection as a health behavior, I won't dwell on this point because I feel like the speakers yesterday covered it already so well. But just to be clear, when I talk about social disconnection, there's these components that are separable, obviously very related components, but separable components, one of which is the loneliness component, which I would define as a subjective feeling, a psychological experience, as well as the social isolation piece, which is objectively measurable. It's about the number of social interactions you're having, the size of your network of social connections, number of relationships you have, and so on. And these two pieces obviously are both essential pieces of social connection. And not having enough or having too much loneliness are essential parts of the experience of social disconnection. And in terms of relating these forms of social disconnection to physical health, I would argue that, like in my current read of the literature, that the state of our field is that there's been more done on the side of looking at the influence of social isolation and its impacts on health. So I think all of us can probably bring to mind a few different examples of how social isolation might affect our physical health. These could be very simple examples, like if you live alone and you experience a health emergency, you don't have someone to take you to the hospital immediately. Or, if you're single and not partnered and you don't have close family and friends, maybe you don't have someone to remind you to take your your heart medication every day. Or if you don't have a large network of friends and acquaintances, maybe you're actually living a less physically active, more sedentary life because you're not going out as much to see friends and acquaintances. So those are all ways in which the number of social interactions and contacts and relationships that you have can influence your physical health. One thing that I got really interested in as a psychologist, as someone who's interested in our thoughts and our feelings, is how does our loneliness, is there a way in which loneliness, which is something that, people typically think of as existing in our heads and as a psychological experience, are there ways in which loneliness can directly impact our physical health? So that's where I would like to start here in terms of my talk. How does loneliness, again, which is this emotional experience, a psychological state that starts in our heads, how does that get under the skin to influence our physical health? Okay, so that's where I'll start. And so some very basic biology here. There's increasing research suggesting that loneliness can impact our physical health through the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is controlled by our brain and our spine, and it has these links to all these our bodily organs. And it is definitely a key component of this mind-body link, a way in which our psychological experiences, our thoughts and our feelings can have physical consequences. So a common experience or a common thing that people can relate to, I think, is on the sympathetic side. So that this is on the right side of the slide, the sympathetic nervous system. It's commonly known as a fight or flight system. So even if you just imagine something that's threatening or causes you anxiety or that you're afraid of, it's a threat and that you're stressed by, you will get a physical reaction. And that's sort of governed by the sympathetic nervous system. And so, your pupils will dilate, your heart rate will increase, and that's all your body responding to these thoughts and emotions, trying to prepare your body energetically to deal with that stressor in the environment, right? To fight or to flee. And so this bodily response happens pretty automatically and pretty quickly. And so that's just one example of how our thoughts and our feelings can play out in this very immediate physical way. I'd also like to bring attention to this other side, so the left side of my slide, the parasympathetic nervous system that operates sort of in tandem with the sympathetic nervous system. Sometimes it's maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but if it's helpful, sometimes people talk about the sympathetic as the gas and the parasympathetic as the brakes. So the parasympathetic nervous system comes online in various circumstances too, and it also helps us deal with what's happening in our environment. So the parasympathetic system can get activated or come online in response to having to come back down from a stressor, right? So after your body has dealt with the stressor, fighting or fleeing, then the parasympathetic can kind of activate and come online and help us recover from that experience and help us bring our bodies back down to a state of homeostasis. It also doesn't require that we activate the sympathetic nervous system before a parasympathetic comes online. The parasympathetic can also activate or come online when we have a situation where instead of needing to sort of recruit more energy to deal with something in our environment, we actually want to conserve energy and we want to sort of withdraw. So those are circumstances in which the parasympathetic might come online. And one thing that's quite exciting to researchers is that there is a very reliable way to detect parasympathetic nervous system activity, and that's through heart rate variability, abbreviated HRV here. And so heart rate variability, very simply stated, is the variability in the intervals between your heartbeats. Okay, and so if you measure that at rest, so just at baseline, then what you'll see is that people can have a high resting heart rate variability depicted here in green, or a low resting HRV depicted here in red, meaning less variability in between those the intervals, the time intervals of those heartbeats. And these have been strong, these different patterns, the high versus low resting HRV, that's been linked to risk for cardiovascular disease and mortality. So the high HRV is linked to the reduced risk for cardiovascular disease and mortality, and the low resting HRV, the opposite. Okay, and so one way you can think of this is before your body is reacting to anything. This is just if somebody's sitting quietly, you can measure their HRV and get this index basically of their body's capacity, even at rest, how prepared their body is just generally to react to stressors or to react to environmental stimuli as they come in. Okay, and then so you can measure this resting HRV, and you can also measure HRV reactivity. So you can have something occur and then look at what happens to the change in HRV. And that HRV reactivity to a specific event that's occurring in the environment gives you an index of basically how strongly the parasympathetic nervous system is reacting in the moment. And so for that HRV reactivity, I will say, just to set up, so you can interpret what I'm showing you later in terms of the patterns of the data, it's not necessarily good or bad to have a high reactivity to an event or a lower reactivity event. I would say it's just important that it's proportional, right? So that your body, it's an adaptive response that your body goes through to be able to react to something in the environment. So in terms of how much of a response you have to a particular event in the environment, that's, kind of just want, in terms of a healthy response, you want that response to be proportional so that your body can deal with that response. Okay, so this is my student, Charlotte Roddick, a PhD student in my lab. So she and I got interested in whether there was a relationship between both chronic loneliness and also acute or state or momentary experiences of loneliness on heart rate variability. So what we did is we measured chronic loneliness and resting heart rate variability in 265 female undergraduates. Here we focused on getting a single sex sample, simply because there's known sex differences in the physiology of heart rate variability. And we were concerned that if we try to split our sample and get half males and half females, that we might have a lower statistical power to really detect an effect reliably. So here in this data set that I'm showing you today, we focused on female participants only, but right now we are following up and looking at male participants. But just wanted to point out, so that's the logic here. We wanted to get a large sample, and we wanted to make sure that whatever we were finding here, we were able to say something reliable about the pattern. So the first thing that we found was that chronic loneliness was associated with lower resting heart rate variability. What I'm showing you here in blue, if you're a data nerd, this is just for the statistical analyses that I'm showing you in blue. You can ignore them if it's not necessary that you pay attention, but if you want, those are showing you kind of the relative effect size and also the statistical significance. But all of the results that I'll be going through today are statistically significant results. So here, again, chronic loneliness was statistically significantly associated with lower resting heart rate variability. And again, on the slide that I showed you previously, that lower resting HRV is the pattern that's linked to higher risk of cardiovascular disease and heightened mortality risk. Okay, so again, but this so far is just an association that we're seeing. Now, we did go in and look at whether this was a robust and specific relationship, and we found that it was. This relationship between low resting HRV and higher chronic loneliness remains significant after you control for age, body mass index, and respiration, which are all known to affect resting HRV. And importantly, it also remains statistically significant even after we controlled for other psychological variables that are, I would say, overlapping with conceptually, but distinguishable from loneliness. So this relationship remained significant even after we controlled for depression, anxiety, and perceived stress. Okay, so then that's the relationship between chronic loneliness and resting HRV. Next, we wanted to move on to a question of a more fine-grained time period. What about an acute experience of loneliness? Can we see how the body is reacting kind of more quickly in the moment of experiencing acute loneliness? And does that experience and does the body's physiological reaction to an experience of loneliness differ for people who are chronically lonely versus non-lonely? So we had that same set of 265 female undergraduates, and we had them in the lab, and we induced loneliness in them. Okay, so in order to study the effects of experiencing loneliness, you have to be able to measure, create that experience in the lab, and then measure things. So how we did this, in brief, is we asked participants to write about a time that we're lonely, and to type that into a computer for 10 minutes. And then we had a cover story. We said that we had a linguistics analysis software program that would automatically analyze the patterns of their phrasing and their vocabulary and provide a score of their loneliness based on the text that they'd spent 10 minutes writing. And unbeknownst to them, all of our participants actually got the same feedback. We told all of them, we gave them a relatively high loneliness score that we told them that was based on what they had written. And we told them that their text suggested that they were lonelier than average. Don't worry, at the end of the experiment, we did debrief everybody. We said, sorry, we did have this deception. The reason we did this is that so we could standardize this experience so that we really wanted to be able to study the experience of loneliness. So we did reassure everybody, that feedback was not based on anything specific to their own writing. And we did, at the end of the study, also try to induce a positive mood to get people back. So again, we wanted to create this limited experience of loneliness in the lab. And then we also measured heart rate variability both before and after we told them to do before and after we induced the loneliness. And by measuring heart rate variability before and after, we were able to get this measure of heart rate variability reactivity, HRV reactivity. Again, that's the response to something specific that's happening right now in your environment, okay? And so we took the difference of where their HRV was after versus where it was before they went through this loneliness induction. And a couple things that we found here. The first thing we found was that in general, increases in acute loneliness, so the more someone said their loneliness went up, because we also asked them before and after they went through this lonely induction, how lonely are you in this moment? And the more people were saying their loneliness went up, the greater their HRV reactivity was. That suggests that as you experience more loneliness, your body's sort of responding in this physiological way, recruiting more of this parasympathetic activation in response to that loneliness that you're experiencing as an emotion. The second interesting thing that we found was that greater chronic loneliness predicted stronger HRV reactivity to the loneliness induction. Now, I told you before that having more or less HRV reactivity to something that's happening in your environment is not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it should be proportional, right? So what does this second effect tell us? I think the second effect, first of all, simply tells us, okay, if you're already chronically lonely and then you're going through an experience of loneliness in the moment and you're feeling acutely lonely in that moment, your body is responding more to that experience and recruiting more of this parasympathetic nervous system to respond or to deal with that experience, that emotional experience of loneliness. Again, in the moment, that might not be a bad thing, right? That's your body's response to something that it needs to deal with in the environment. However, again, trying to put these results together, right? Because I told you before that that chronically lonely people had lower resting HRV. So how does that all come together? Why is it the case that people who were feeling more lonely in the moment and had more chronic loneliness had this higher reactivity in the moment, but then in the long term, in this resting state, they had the lower resting HRV? So that actually, more research, the first thing I'll need to say is more research definitely needs to be done. But one possibility that I'd like to suggest, I think one intriguing possibility is that if you have this repeated strong activation of the parasympathetic nervous system to deal with acute episodes of loneliness, again, once in a while, or if it's really fleeting and momentary, that might not be a problem. But if you're having this happen repeatedly, and if you're having a very strong activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, it might add up to lead to long-term detrimental effects. It might be causing wear and tear on the functioning of the overall system. A metaphor that people sometimes use to describe this kind of like wear and tear and how that occurs is like a spring. So when you have a spring and you stretch it out a little bit once in a while, it can recover easily, right? It can go back to the state it was. But if you repeatedly stretch it too much, then that spring is going to eventually lose elasticity and function less efficiently in the long term. So that's one possibility of how these patterns might be linked, of the acute loneliness, these momentary experiences of loneliness, not necessarily being problematic, but then if experienced too intensely and too repeatedly, perhaps having this overall long-term wear and tear effect on your body. Okay, so this other study I'm going to cover just very briefly. I'm looking at the clock and trying not to run too much overtime here. The second study, what we did was we measured participants who had just recently moved to Vancouver, and we tracked them over time. So we tracked them for 3 months. So we first measured their systolic blood pressure within the first 6 weeks of when they'd moved to Vancouver. And then we measured their systolic blood pressure again 3 months after their first measurement. Okay. And a couple interesting things that we found there. First of all, in the first 6 weeks after moving to Vancouver, when we measured people then, when we measured those recent movers, they had elevated systolic blood pressure relative to people who were not recent movers, relative to people who had age-matched, gender-matched controls who had lived in Vancouver for at least 5 years. Okay, so there seems to be something about that experience of moving to a new city, having to reestablish yourself in a new city that is coming out in this higher elevated blood pressure. 3 months later, most people's blood pressure, most of our movers, their blood pressure had come back down, but it was variable how much their blood pressure had come back down to the level of where the non-movers were. And fascinating pattern that we found is that was associated relatively strongly with the extent to which they were building social networks in Vancouver. So we had a measure based on basically how many friends and acquaintances people were making local in Vancouver. And as you might expect, brand new people to Vancouver don't have many. And people varied a lot in how, at 3 months, how much they had built that network versus they had not been as successful in building that network. And we did see that direct relationship there, that correlation between how much they were building their social network locally and how much their blood pressure was coming down. Okay, again, all of these studies that I'm going to be telling you about have different limitations, have different kind of methodological constraints in what we could control for and what kind of claims we can make about causality versus this is just an association. So I do want to put that out there that each of these studies looked at in isolation has its own limitations. But what I'm trying to build here is a picture that overall now we have two effects where we're measuring slightly different aspects of the cardiovascular system, heart rate variability, as well as systolic blood pressure. We're measuring these aspects of social connection in different ways in terms of loneliness versus the size of your social networks. And we're seeing kind of overall the picture that's coming together, I think, is consistent. And that is that social disconnection can have direct impacts on the cardiovascular system in ways that are very relevant to physical health. And secondly, that what we saw in that first study was that repeated experience of loneliness may accumulate to bring about long-term adverse health outcomes. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to my next point, which is about behaviors and cognitions that we engage in our daily life and how those might influence loneliness. Again, I think Pete nicely kind of set up, Pete and John in their conversation at the very beginning of this morning's introduction, set up a nice intro into this and talking about the influence of technology and smartphone use. We got interested in this question too in my lab. And so this was a study that I did with Christine Enderell, who's on the left here. She's a former postdoctoral fellow in my lab, and Marlies Hofer, who's on the right here. She's a former PhD student in my lab. And what we did is we objectively quantified screen time for 485 smartphone users over the course of 6 days. And how we did this is we had them install an app on their phone that passively logged whether their screen was on or off. With their consent and with their knowledge, we told them that that's what the app would do. And so we had a very fine-grained kind of temporally fine-grained and precise measurement of when they were using their phone, how much they were using their phone over the course of these 6 days. And then participants provided data 3 times a day through it. We sent them a notification through the same app, and once in the morning, once in the afternoon, once in the evening of every day for 6 days, with the exact time kind of randomized. But morning, afternoon, evening, they completed a brief survey. And in this brief survey, they asked about their momentary loneliness. They were asked, how lonely are you feeling right now? and also how socially connected are you feeling right now. And we took those two measures and we just took the average because we wanted, that's our overall measure of kind of social connection and loneliness. And then we also asked them, how much have you had any live social interaction, offline social interaction since the last survey? And so this is self-report. So they simply reported on a scale from not at all to very much, how much, if any, live social interaction they'd had since we last surveyed them. Okay. And so first set of results here, smartphone use and live social interaction were negatively correlated. And this was true both between individuals and within individuals. So the first result that you see here is the result when you compare different people to each other. So the first result is showing you, saying that when you look at just on the level of individuals, people who use their smartphone more overall, in general, also are the same people who tend to report less live social interaction overall. Okay, so that's the between subject comparison, between participant comparison. And then we also had the capacity with this method to look within individuals. So what I mean by that is if you just look at a single person and then, you know, look across the whole sample, but looking within a single person, we can look at relative to my own average during periods of the day when I am engaging in more smartphone use than my own average, I tend to be also engaging in less live social interaction than my own average. So that's a within subject effect. So my own behavior varies across the course of the day and across the sequence of days. And those variables are related. Those behaviors are inversely related within individuals as well. Okay, then next thing we wanted to look at is how is this linked to loneliness and social connection? Okay, so first result, when people have more live social interactions, this was a within subject effect too. So this is, when I say more here, I mean relative to their own average, right? So at times of the day or during survey periods, during these, over the course of these 6 days that we measured people, during periods where people were having more social interactions than their own average, they told us that they felt more socially connected than their own average afterwards when we surveyed them. Okay, so that's probably not so surprising to anybody. So more live social interaction makes people feel socially connected. Okay, pretty obvious result. Another interesting result that we found was that when people use their smartphones more during a particular survey period than their own average, they felt less socially connected afterwards. And then we flipped that temporal relationship around. And instead of looking at what happened with smartphone use and looking at the effect on later social connection, we flipped it around. We looked at what people told us in any given survey about their current momentary feelings of social connectedness and loneliness, and then what they did afterwards. And what we found there is that at moments where people felt less socially connected and more lonely than they typically did, they tended to use their smartphones more afterwards. Okay, so putting together those second and third results, what does that suggest? To me, it suggests a potential vicious cycle of loneliness, wherein people tend to turn to their smartphones rather than seeking live social interaction when they feel lonely, but that actually tends to result in more loneliness. I will here have say very transparently with the caveat that here, in our particular design for this experiment or this study, we were treating smartphone use as kind of a monolithic singular behavior, right? And I'm sure a lot of your minds, you're thinking, well, but people can be doing so many things on their smartphones. They might be texting with their close friends. They might be having a video conference with their colleagues, or they might be connecting to an old friend over a phone call, or they could be posting on social media. They could be playing an online game. They could be doom scrolling right through recent events, through news sites. And I do not predict that those different activities would have the same effects on loneliness or social connection. And I'm not able to say that with clarity with this particular design, because all we were measuring here and all I'm showing the results on here is about the results of the screen time, overall screen time, right? Just were you using your smartphone or not? But what I will say that this result suggests is that overall, when you do treat smartphone use as a kind of monolithic activity in people's days, that it seems to be the case that in general, people tend to be using their smartphones overall in ways that in which the negative effects are seeming to outweigh the positive effects. Okay, so this is not an argument for never using your smartphone again or anything like that. It's an argument to be aware of how your smartphone use and the different things that you might be using your smartphone for might be affecting your loneliness, your social connection, and your well-being more generally. In terms of cognitions and our beliefs and how those might affect our loneliness. So first of all, there's a lot of important and influential theories about loneliness that suggest, and that I believe, that suggest that momentary feelings of loneliness are not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, they can serve as a really adaptive signal. In the same way that when we feel hunger, that can cause us to go seek out food. So the experience of hunger is, has this adaptive function in that it elicits a certain kind of behavioral response. Acute loneliness can serve as an adaptive signal that, hey, I'm feeling lonely, I'm missing out on I'm missing a social connection here. It can prompt a behavioral response of going out to seek the social connection. However, when loneliness becomes chronic, that's when it sort of has this insidious pattern where it starts to become linked to a set of negative cognitions and negative behavioral responses to that feeling of loneliness. So specifically, people who are chronically lonely are likely to have more negative cognitions and negative beliefs about social interactions. They're likely to feel anxious about the idea of engaging in a social interaction. They are more likely to expect that if they are trying to seek out a social connection, they might be rejected, and just in general have negative feelings and beliefs about social interactions. And I want to acknowledge those feelings and those expectations might truly be based on past experiences, that people who are chronically lonely may have had a lot of experiences in the past where they have been rejected. They have had negative anxiety-producing social interactions. So, however, the problem and the insidious nature of this is that when you have those expectations, then the tendency is to withdraw when you're experiencing loneliness, right? Rather than to socially approach. And once you withdraw, then you never have the chance, or you're just really minimizing your chance to ever change those cognitions and ever get to a point where you can rise out of that loneliness, because the withdrawal behavior then, kind of is perpetuated by these continuing negative expectations, further withdrawal into this cycle, this negative cycle of loneliness. So here, takeaways from this section. Live social interaction is essential for social connection. I think all of us know that and believe that, but people often fail to seek it out, especially when they're lonely. We saw that in the smartphone data. Smartphones might simply be such an easy distraction for people that it's just easier to pick up your smartphone when you're feeling lonely than it is to try to reconnect to a friend, to try to set up a chance to have a in-person meeting with somebody. So that could be a problem. So just the ease and the convenience and the distractibility of that we experience with these common technologies that we have. And then on top of that, that negative cognitions about social interactions, so these anxieties or these expectations of rejection, can operate in a feedback loop where they cause people, or they lead people to withdraw rather than socially approach when they experience loneliness, in a way that just further deepens loneliness. Okay, so this is all sounding, I think, a bit pessimistic, right? These cycles that we get into where the loneliness just kind of prompts behaviors and cognitions that then perpetuate the loneliness. But I do want to end my last section that I want to talk about. What can we do about it? I do want to end on an optimistic note. So I think there's actually a lot we can do about this. So another line of work in my lab is to try to intervene on loneliness, and specifically given this evidence that there is this loop, this feedback loop between the negative cognitions and then this withdrawal behavior that tend to perpetuate loneliness, we're trying to break that loop, replace it instead with a feedback loop of positive cognitions and positive social behaviors, approach behaviors that might feed on each other to actually reduce loneliness. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? I'm going to present one way. I'm not saying this is the only way to do that, but I do want to get people thinking about this idea that these thoughts and behaviors operate in this loop. And when you're able to operate on one of them or both of them together in such a way that they feed back on each other in a positive way rather than a negative way, that can be a really powerful way for these interventions that we're trying out to really have sustainable, self-sustaining effects on people's loneliness and social connection. So the way that we're trying to do it in our lab is through daily acts of kindness. We are not the first researchers to study acts of kindness or develop interventions on acts of kindness using acts of kindness. But I think, to my knowledge, we are either the first or among the first researchers to really think about this in terms of what its effects on loneliness and social connection might be. And the reason we think that acts of kindness, and so, I will say this work is led by Yeun Archer Lee, who some of you might have heard her talk yesterday on the Community Cohesion Index, the CCI, that she's also working on. So she's, definitely, she's the lead author on this, but we have this great team. So Gu Li on the right side, former postdoc in my lab, and Yingqi Guo in the middle, former undergraduate in my lab, also still a graduate student at UBC, working on this project together. So the reason we thought that acts of kindness would be particularly powerful in terms of breaking that negative, that feedback loop I was telling you about before and replacing it with a more positive one is, first of all, acts of kindness provide a self-initiated way to increase social interaction, right? So when you're told, do an act of kindness, just do a simple act of kindness and commit yourself to that once a day, for example, for a few weeks, right? It doesn't require you to get invited to a party by someone else. It doesn't even require you to reach out to a friend and risk the rejection of that friend saying, no, sorry, I can't hang out. So even for people who are chronically lonely, we were thinking this might be an easier way into creating those opportunities for social interaction and social contact. Okay, by giving them a simple instruction, something very doable that just requires them to have this proactive decision to engage in this act of kindness. And secondly, and importantly, acts of kindness generally result in positive social feedback. So the recipient of your kind act is likely to smile back at you, to express appreciation and gratitude. And we thought that positive feedback might help to break those negative cognitions, or those expectations of rejection, or that anxiety, or those expectations this interaction is just not going to go well, which tend to characterize and tend to cause more issues with chronic loneliness in people who have those kinds of beliefs and thoughts about social interaction. Okay, so what we did here is we tested whether an acts of kindness intervention can increase social interaction and reduce loneliness. So what we did is we randomly assigned, we had 407 undergraduates from UBC, and we randomly assigned them to one of 3 different 2-week interventions. So for 14 days, they were told either perform 1 act of kindness per day. We gave them some examples of acts of kindness, simple acts of kindness they could do. Or they were told perform 1 anonymous act of kindness per day. The reason we had that condition is because we specifically wanted to test whether the feedback, the social feedback, was an important active ingredient in any of the effects we were going to see. And we thought it might be, for the reasons that I was telling you before, that if you're not getting that social feedback of somebody smiling back at you when the recipient of your kind act smiling back at you or expressing gratitude, then maybe there's not a strong ability of this behavior to then feed back into the cognitions and change the negative cognitions about social interactions that you might hold. So we put that condition in there to kind of look specifically at the role of this feedback that people are either getting or not getting when they perform an anonymous versus non-anonymous act of kindness. And finally, we had what's called an active control. We asked the final 1/3 of participants who are randomly assigned to that group to just take a short break every day, to engage in this act of kind of self-focused self-care. And so then we compared the effects on these 3 groups on their daily social interaction, which we measured for 3 days before this 2-week intervention, and also for 3 days after. So we measured how many different people, how many different social interactions they had, averaged across 3 days, both before and after. We also measured their daily loneliness, again, averaged out over the 3 days right before they engaged in this intervention that we put them through, and also after. And finally, we measured their baseline chronic loneliness in the same way that I typically do in my study using the UCLA loneliness scale. Okay, and what we found here is, first of all, those students, those participants who were in our acts of kindness intervention, for them, they experienced they reported a significant increase in daily social interactions after this 2-week intervention, acts of kindness intervention. The effect was there for that particular intervention and not there for the other 2 interventions. As a reminder, the other 2 interventions were the acts of self-care, take a break every day, or engage in an anonymous act of kindness. So we didn't see that same effect, that same beneficial effect of the intervention on the daily social interactions and the other 2 conditions. I think that's important because it tells us something about possibly this idea that feedback is very important, that social feedback that you get when you're able to interact with that recipient of your kind act does seem to be doing something special here. Secondly, for the acts of kindness intervention, we found a significant decrease in daily loneliness levels for the chronically lonely individuals. When we split people up, we didn't see the effect overall, but then we divided the group up into people who were chronically lonely to start with and not chronically lonely to start with. And as you might imagine, the people who are not chronically lonely to start with were reporting pretty low levels of daily loneliness. And so maybe they were at low levels and there was nothing really there's not much further down they could go. So with that group, the non-chronically lonely people, we didn't see any significant effects of being in any of these interventions. But for the people who reported a higher than average level of chronic loneliness when they began our study, for them, those of them who went through the acts of kindness intervention experienced a decrease in their daily levels of loneliness after going through this intervention. And that effect was not observed in the other 2 interventions. So wrapping up with these 3 studies, again, I started with this idea that social connection is intimately tied to our health. And it is something that is tied to our behaviors as well. It is something that we can affect through our daily behaviors and our daily cognitions and thoughts and beliefs. So these are the main takeaways that I'd like to leave you with, that I think social connection is as central to our health as our diet, our physical activity, and our sleep quality. And similarly to how we can change our diet, our physical activity, we can work on the amount of sleep we get every night. Small changes to our daily behavior impact on our social connection at the individual level. So there's a lot that we can do as individuals to increase our social connection by thinking about and being really intentional about our daily behaviors and beliefs. But I'd also like to point out, I don't think this is ultimately going to be an issue. The social connection is going to be an issue that we should leave to individuals. And I think, again, others yesterday, and I'm sure others today will make this point, that we need to be operating on multiple levels, that it's not just looking for individuals to change their behaviors and cognitions, but also looking for buy-in from governments, looking for communities to come together to develop effective interventions to work on these issues, to have community groups, to have governments, to have nonprofits all working together and moving beyond the individual level to look at this issue. So yeah, with that, final slide is my acknowledgements of the collaborators that I mentioned that really led all this research, and the funding agencies for my work. So thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I'm just scrolling through the comments here, and it does seem as if, and I'm actually not surprised, and it confirms some of my own prejudice and biases. A lot of response to the use of technology and smartphones as in terms of, I don't. I can go back to the top. There was lots of response around the science that you're working on, but this later bit about the smartphones certainly seems to have hit a chord with our audience. We don't really have any time for any questions, but as a final act of I hope you interpret it as a final act of kindness. Here's a poem for you about your presentation. Okay. It also draws a little bit on some other stuff. So here's a fact for the start. Loneliness has a direct impact on your heart. It contributes to dementia too, depression and anxiety, to name a few. Loneliness is like hunger or thirst. It's okay in small doses, but too much and you're cursed. Overcome your fear of rejection. Set aside your introspection. Resist the temptation to withdraw. Don't let fear become a fatal flaw. I feel lonely. I check my phone, which makes me feel even more alone. So then I check my phone. So how can I overcome the negative feedback loop? Listen carefully. Here's the scoop. Commit to kindness every day and start your journey back to okay. Okay, so that's just, it doesn't do you justice, Francis, but I was sort of playing with some words and couldn't resist.
I love it.
So anyway, for what it's worth, thank you so much. That was great. The next session starts in a couple of minutes. Pete will be introducing that. There's going to be discussion about the workplace, which is the area where I'm sort of most connected around social connections. So I'm certainly looking forward a lot to that. So thank you so much. That was fantastic. That was a great session. Lots of information, and like I say, I think pulling on threads that are of huge interest to our audience. So really appreciate it. Thank you.